Clara stepped off the dusty wagon, her heart pounding with hope and fear. She had imagined a quiet life with a husband who would take her hand and build a home with her, but the man who awaited her was nothing like she expected. Tayan, an Apache warrior with eyes as sharp as the desert sun and a silence that spoke volumes, seemed determined to keep her at a distance. In this vast, unforgiving land, could a stranger from the East ever find her place? Or his heart? Before starting the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Clara's journey had been long and exhausting. The train that carried her across the sprawling plains of the East finally gave way to a rattling wagon, winding through arid landscapes she had only seen in painted pictures. The sky above the southwestern frontier stretched wide and unbroken, its harsh sun beating down on the dust-streaked road. Every mile forward made the world she knew, her family, her small town, her familiar routines feel more distant. Clara carried with her not just a small trunk of belongings, but also a heart full of hope and uncertainty. She had agreed to become a mail-order bride because she believed in the possibility of a new life, one of security, companionship, and perhaps even love. Yet now, standing on this unknown soil, she felt an almost dizzying weight of expectation and fear pressing upon her. The small settlement where she was to meet her intended husband was little more than a scattering of wooden structures, a post office, and a trading store. The air was dry, tinged with the scent of sagebrush and distant fires, and the sound of wind whistling through the canyons created a lonely, almost intimidating atmosphere. Clara's fingers clutched her bonnet as the wagon stopped, and she scanned the faces waiting near the post office. None seemed immediately familiar or welcoming. Then, a tall figure emerged from the shade of a nearby tree, broad-shouldered, silent and commanding attention without saying a word. This was Tayan, an Apache warrior, and not the man she had imagined when she envisioned her future husband. Their first meeting was cautious. Clara's polite smile and gentle curtsy were met with a measured nod, his eyes observing her like a hawk scrutinizing unfamiliar terrain. Tayan's presence radiated authority and quiet strength, yet there was an undercurrent of tension. He did not speak at first, letting the silence stretch between them. Clara felt the prickling unease of being judged, evaluated, and found wanting. She realized that she had stepped into a world where her previous notions of marriage, love, and domestic life might not hold any weight. Tayan, she could tell, was a man defined by his duty, his people, and the land he had sworn to protect, not by the expectations of an Eastern bride. The early interactions were filled with small misunderstandings. Clara, accustomed to the more formal manners of her hometown, misread gestures and customs. She attempted to offer a polite greeting in English, unaware that Tayan's limited English made it difficult for him to fully comprehend her words. He, in turn, responded with a reserved nod or a neutral expression, which she initially interpreted as coldness or disinterest. The cultural divide was palpable, stretching wide like the desert around them, and Clara felt both fascinated and intimidated by him. She had expected discomfort. Moving to a new place always carried challenges, but the intensity of this particular divide startled her. As the day wore on, Clara began to observe Tayan more closely. He moved with the confidence and precision of someone intimately connected to the land. His eyes constantly scanned the horizon, alert to even the smallest signs of danger. He respected the earth, the animals, and the community around him, maintaining a balance that Clara had never experienced in her structured, predictable life back east. Though their initial contact was distant, Clara could sense an unspoken code in his actions, a deep-rooted honor and loyalty that made her heart both nervous and intrigued. She realized that to survive and perhaps to thrive, she would need to approach this new life not with assumptions, but with humility, patience, and a willingness to learn. By evening, As the sun dipped below the jagged hills, Clara was shown to the small dwelling that would be her temporary home. Tayan spoke for the first time, offering her basic instructions on household routines, manners, and the expectations of living near the tribe. His voice was calm, firm, yet not unkind. Clara listened intently, her nerves still raw but her curiosity growing. She began to understand that this life, unlike anything she had known, required resilience, adaptability, and respect for traditions far different from her own. Despite the uncertainty, a spark of determination ignited within her. If she could navigate this foreign world, perhaps there was a chance to find a connection, not just with the man standing before her, but with the land, the people, and ultimately, herself. That night, as Clara lay on the simple cot provided, she stared out the window at the sprawling desert bathed in silver moonlight. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it both danger and possibility. She thought of Tayan, of his quiet strength and piercing gaze, and felt a mixture of fear and fascination. This frontier was a place of trial where courage and patience were as essential as food and water. Clara knew that the days ahead would be challenging, but she also sensed that the man who seemed so distant might one day become someone indispensable to her heart. For now, though, she would take her first breaths of this new life, filled with equal parts hope, anxiety, and the unspoken promise of discovery. The next morning dawned with the pale light of the desert sun spilling across the settlement, casting long shadows over the wooden structures. Clara awoke to the unfamiliar sounds of birds she had never seen, the distant howling of coyotes, and the faint rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation. She dressed quickly, eager to greet the day, and stepped outside to find Tayan already up, tending to the horses with a quiet efficiency that suggested years of experience. He barely acknowledged her presence, focused on his work, and Clara felt a pang of unease. Her hope for companionship had collided with the reality of his stoic demeanor, and she realized that earning his trust would be far more complicated than she had imagined. As she tried to introduce herself with a timid smile, Tayan's response was a simple nod. His eyes, dark and penetrating, seemed to measure her every movement. Clara had expected some warmth, a conversation to ease the awkwardness of their first meeting. But instead, she was met with a barrier of silence. It was clear that he did not view her as an equal in knowledge or experience. Everything she did was scrutinized, her attempts to help with chores, her clumsy handling of tools, even the way she carried herself as she walked. Clara quickly realized that her polished manners from the East held little value here. Practicality, endurance, and respect for the land and its people mattered far more. The cultural differences were immediately apparent. Clara had been taught to express herself openly, to rely on verbal communication and polite gestures, yet Tayan's world valued actions over words and observation over explanation. When she offered to help him with the horses, he responded with a terse hand gesture and a brief instruction she barely understood. She tried again, mimicking his careful movements, but her hands fumbled, dropping a brush onto the dirt. Tayan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in warning, a silent reminder that mistakes could have consequences in this unforgiving land. Clara felt a flush of embarrassment and frustration. She was determined to do well, but everything seemed unfamiliar, and her mistakes only reinforced the distance between them. The villagers themselves added to her anxiety. Some were polite but distant, whispering among themselves as Clara passed, while others openly questioned her motives. Was she truly committed to this new life? Could she respect their traditions, or was she merely a stranger imposed upon them? Clara overheard fragments of conversation as she fetched water from the well, feeling the weight of every skeptical gaze. Tayan, she noticed, seemed equally attuned to these judgments, his protective instincts sharpened by years of safeguarding his people from outsiders who could not be trusted. The tension between them was tangible, a silent struggle of trust and understanding that neither knew how to navigate yet. As the day wore on, Clara attempted to find common ground. She observed Taeyeon's routine, how he inspected the fences, tended the horses, and spoke sparingly yet respectfully to the village elders. She began mimicking his actions, quietly practicing the skills he valued, hoping her effort would signal her willingness to learn. Taeyeon, for his part, watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. Occasionally, he offered a curt nod or a short comment, acknowledging her progress, yet always maintaining the barrier that separated them. Clara understood that this was not personal. His caution was born of experience and responsibility, a lifetime of ensuring the survival of his people in a world that often threatened them. By evening, frustration had begun to take hold. Clara felt both physically exhausted and emotionally drained. She had expected challenges, but the weight of mistrust and cultural divide pressed heavily upon her. She retreated to her small room, staring at the desert beyond the window, wondering if she would ever truly belong here. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, a quiet determination stirred within her. She realized that she could not force Taeyeon to accept her through words or charm alone. She would need to demonstrate her respect, her courage, and her willingness to embrace this unfamiliar way of life fully. Only through consistent effort and understanding could the walls between them begin to crumble. As night fell, the desert air cooled, and Clara listened to the distant sounds of the tribe settling down. Taeyeon's silhouette was visible in the moonlight, standing tall and alert, a figure of strength and vigilance. Clara felt a mixture of apprehension and admiration, recognizing that the man she faced was not simply a potential husband, but a protector, a leader, and a person bound by deep honor. She understood that their journey together would require patience, humility, and courage. The seeds of mutual respect had yet to sprout, but Clara resolved to nurture them, believing that understanding, even in the face of initial mistrust, could grow into something far more enduring: trust, partnership, and perhaps eventually, love. The days that followed Clara's arrival were filled with small, quiet lessons. She learned the rhythm of the settlement, the routines of the tribe, and the practical skills that were vital for survival in the harsh desert. Each morning, Taeyeon moved with purposeful efficiency, and Clara observed him from a careful distance, noting how he respected the land, treated the animals, and interacted with his people. Though he remained reserved and distant, she sensed that his watchful gaze was more than mere scrutiny. It was a test, a measure of her character and willingness to belong in a world far removed from the East. Clara realized that words alone would not earn Taeyeon's respect. In his culture, action spoke louder than polite phrases, and sincerity could not be feigned. She began to take small, deliberate steps to help the tribe in ways she could manage. She assisted the women in preparing meals, learning to grind corn and sift flour under their patient guidance. She helped gather firewood, her hands raw from splintered branches, yet steady with determination. Most of all, she cared for the children, teaching simple songs in English, playing games, and tending to scrapes and bruises with gentle hands. In return, the children warmed to her quickly, their laughter and trust a small but significant bridge between Clara and this foreign land. Taeyeon watched her quietly during these acts. He observed the way she spoke softly to the children, the care she took with the elderly, and the patience she exhibited when learning new tasks. He noted that her efforts were not performed for recognition, but from a genuine desire to help, to integrate, and to show respect. Slowly, his initial skepticism began to soften. Clara's courage and determination were evident. She faced physical labor and unfamiliar customs with resilience, demonstrating a willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of the community. Taeyeon, who had spent years protecting his people from outsiders who could bring harm or disruption, could not ignore the sincerity in her actions. One afternoon, an elderly woman in the tribe fell ill. Clara noticed immediately, recognizing signs of dehydration and weakness. Without hesitation, she fetched water, prepared herbal remedies as instructed by the village healers, and sat by the woman's side, offering comfort and care throughout the day. Tayan arrived during this time, his expression unreadable as he assessed the situation. He observed Clara's dedication, noting the gentleness in her hands and the quiet authority she displayed when caring for someone in need. By evening, the woman had stabilized, and Clara, exhausted but fulfilled, finally allowed herself a moment of quiet relief. Tayan's acknowledgment came in the form of a brief nod. A gesture small yet significant, it was the first silent affirmation that he saw her as more than a fragile outsider. The bond between Clara and the tribe began to grow. She learned the proper way to fetch water without disturbing sacred spaces, the careful method of preparing meals for the community, and the stories behind rituals she had once found intimidating. In every interaction, Clara approached with humility, seeking guidance rather than imposing her own ideas. Tayan noted this humility and respect, recognizing qualities in her that were rare among those who came from the East: patience, empathy, and a willingness to adapt rather than dominate. While she still made mistakes, they were met with gentle correction rather than criticism, and with each small success, her confidence and the tribe's trust in her dash grew. By the end of the week, Clara felt a sense of belonging that had seemed impossible at first. Tayan's presence, though still distant, felt less forbidding. He observed her from afar, silently measuring her growth, her sincerity, and her courage. The walls that had separated them began to show cracks, not through words, but through Clara's consistent demonstration of character. She was learning the rhythms of the land, the customs of the people, and most importantly, the quiet strength required to navigate this unfamiliar world. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Clara found herself sitting beside Tayan near the fire. The children were playing nearby, their laughter echoing across the settlement. Tayan offered her a small, approving glance, his first unguarded expression, acknowledging that she had taken her first real steps toward earning his trust. Clara, feeling the weight of that silent recognition, understood that the journey ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, she sensed a glimmer of possibility, a bridge forming between her world and his, a fragile yet promising connection that might one day grow into something deeper. The desert was unforgiving that afternoon, its heat pressing down like a living weight. Clara had grown accustomed to the harsh sun and the parched earth beneath her feet, yet nothing had prepared her for the sudden arrival of danger. A small group of bandits, opportunistic men drawn to the frontier's isolation, had been spotted near the settlement's perimeter. They sought to steal supplies, disrupt the community, and perhaps take advantage of the tribe's hospitality. Clara first learned of the threat when she noticed the tense expressions of the villagers, their hands moving toward weapons, eyes scanning the horizon. Fear and urgency coiled through the settlement like an electric current. Tayan immediately assumed command. His presence was commanding, every motion purposeful, as he organized the tribe into defensive positions. Clara, who had only recently begun to understand the rhythms of their daily life, felt a mix of awe and trepidation. She realized that this was the moment when the tribe's survival and her own depended not on polite words or gestures, but on courage, quick thinking, and cooperation. For the first time, the distance between herself and Tayan seemed to narrow. Their fates were intertwined, whether she was ready for it or not. As the bandits approached, Clara's instincts kicked in. She remembered the advice she had been given about maintaining safety near the perimeter and assisting the children and elderly. Without waiting for instruction, she helped guide the youngest members of the tribe into a secure area, her hand steady despite her racing heart. Tayan noticed immediately. Instead of rebuke, there was a flicker of respect in his eyes, a recognition that Clara was rising to meet the challenge, not cowering behind fear. Her actions, though small compared to the strategic decisions Tayan made, demonstrated her bravery and willingness to contribute meaningfully in a crisis. The bandits struck quickly, moving through the settlement with the confidence of men accustomed to intimidation. Tayan confronted them with calm authority, his voice carrying commands and warnings, while Clara assisted the villagers in barricading doors and moving supplies to safer locations. At one point, a small fire ignited near the trading post, likely started by one of the intruders. Without hesitation, Clara grabbed a water bucket and rushed to help extinguish the flames. Tayan observed her from a short distance, noting how she did not hesitate to put herself at risk for the good of the community. In that moment, the walls he had maintained around his heart showed the first signs of softening. He began to see Clara as someone capable of bravery and loyalty, qualities he valued above all. Together, Clara and Tayan moved through the chaos with a cautious synchronicity. Tayan guided her away from immediate danger, offering brief instructions she quickly adapted to. The language barrier, which had once been an obstacle, became secondary to shared action and necessity. Through the turmoil, Clara's courage shone not loud or boastful, but steady, quiet, and consistent. Her willingness to step into danger, to act in service of others, revealed a depth of character that words alone could never convey. Tayan began to understand that her intentions were genuine. She had not arrived at the frontier seeking adventure or convenience, but to forge a life rooted in respect, integrity, and resilience. When the skirmish ended and the bandits were driven away, the settlement breathed a collective sigh of relief. Injuries were minimal and no significant damage had been done, thanks in large part to Clara's decisive assistance. Tayan, usually reserved, gave her a nod of approval that carried more weight than any verbal praise. He did not speak of it immediately, but Clara sensed a subtle shift. The distance between them had narrowed, and the first seeds of trust had been planted in the soil of shared danger. That night, as the desert cooled and the stars emerged in a glittering sky, Clara and Tayan sat near the fire, each silently acknowledging the day's events. For Clara, the experience had been terrifying yet illuminating. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. For Tayan, the day had been a revelation as well. Clara's presence was no longer merely tolerated. She had proven herself capable of meeting the challenges of the frontier and standing beside him when it mattered most. In the quiet aftermath, a subtle bond began to form a foundation of mutual respect and reliance, fragile but undeniable. In facing danger together, they had glimpsed the possibility of something deeper than mere coexistence, the beginning of a partnership that might one day grow into love. The days after the bandit attack settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and challenging for Clara. The frontier was still harsh, the sun still relentless, and the desert winds still carried a sense of constant vigilance. Yet something had shifted small, almost imperceptible, but significant. Tayan's eyes, once unreadable and distant, now occasionally lingered on her with a quiet approval, a recognition of her courage during the attack. For Clara, it was a subtle encouragement, a silent invitation to engage more deeply with the life she had once only observed from the periphery. Eager to bridge the divide between herself and the tribe, Clara began participating more actively in their customs. One morning, the women of the village invited her to help with a ceremonial preparation, a gathering that would honor the spirits of the land and the ancestors. At first, Clara was hesitant, unsure of the precise protocols or the meanings behind each gesture and chant. She worried that a misstep would offend the tribe or, worse, anger Tayan, but the women guided her patiently, showing her how to arrange the offerings, light the ceremonial fires, and sing the traditional songs. Clara listened carefully, her heart attuned to the cadence of the language she could barely understand, yet feeling the weight and beauty of the ritual's meaning. Tayan watched her from a short distance, his expression calm yet intensely observant. He noted how she absorbed the customs not as a casual curiosity, but as a sincere effort to understand and honor their traditions. When she stumbled over a chant, she immediately corrected herself, not out of fear of embarrassment, but out of respect for the ceremony. This humility impressed Tayan. He saw that her intentions were genuine, that she was not attempting to impose her own ways, but to integrate herself into the rhythms of a culture so different from her own as days passed. Clara also began to accompany Tayan on his daily duties. She observed how he tended the land, hunted with precision, and interacted with the younger warriors, imparting wisdom without harshness. At first, she merely shadowed him, careful not to intrude, but gradually she learned to assist carrying supplies, scouting paths, and learning basic survival techniques. Tayan's instructions were brief, often communicated with a gesture or a nod rather than words, forcing Clara to rely on observation and intuition. She struggled at times, her hands blistered from the unfamiliar labor, her body exhausted from hours under the desert sun, but she persisted. Each small success was met with a subtle sign of approval from Tayan, a nod, a brief glance, a quiet acknowledgement that encouraged her to continue. In turn, Tayan began to share fragments of his own story. Around evening fires, he spoke of the responsibilities he carried as a warrior, the sacrifices he had made to protect his people, and the history of the land that shaped their lives. He spoke sparingly, revealing only what he felt was necessary, yet Clara listened with rapt attention. She realized that his silence was not indifference, but a measured guard, a protective instinct honed by years of living in a world where trust had to be earned. By showing interest without judgment, by respecting his boundaries, Clara began to earn his confidence. Their interactions, once tense and cautious, now held a quiet rhythm of mutual observation and understanding. One afternoon, Clara joined Tayan and a group of villagers to repair a series of irrigation channels that brought water from a distant creek. She struggled with the heavy tools and uneven terrain, but the other women guided her patiently, and Tayan offered occasional advice, his voice low but firm. At one point, she slipped on a loose rock, nearly falling into a shallow trench. Tayan's hand shot out instinctively, steadying her. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that silent exchange, Clara felt a connection deeper than words, a recognition that they were beginning to move beyond mistrust toward partnership. By the end of the week, Clara felt herself becoming part of the rhythm of the tribe. She understood, in ways she could not yet fully articulate, the values of community, respect, and harmony with the land. Tayan's guarded demeanor softened gradually, his respect for her evident in the way he allowed her to accompany him, to take initiative, and to participate in rituals that had once seemed impenetrable. For both of them, the process was slow, requiring patience, humility, and careful observation. Yet through this shared journey of understanding, Clara and Tayan began to form a bond built not on words or expectations, but on respect, empathy, and the shared effort of learning from one another. That evening, as the desert sun dipped behind the jagged horizon, Clara sat quietly near Tayan, watching the tribe move about their evening routines. The sky blazed with orange and violet hues, reflecting the subtle warmth building between them. Clara understood that this was no longer simply a matter of survival or duty, it was the beginning of a deeper connection, one founded on trust, courage, and the willingness to embrace a world that was once entirely foreign. In the quiet, shared understanding of that moment, the first true threads of love began to take root. The desert, once a place of isolation and trial, began to feel more like a shared world for Clara and Tayan. Each day brought new tasks and challenges: gathering food, tending livestock, repairing structures, and ensuring the safety of the village, but it also offered opportunities for connection. Over time, the initial distance between them had begun to soften. Clara had proven herself capable, resilient, and respectful of the tribe's customs, while Tayan had begun to see her not merely as an outsider, but as someone who could share in the responsibilities, joys, and burdens of his life. It was during the early mornings, as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and copper, that Clara and Tayan found the quietest moments together. Sometimes they worked side by side, hauling water or repairing fences, their hands occasionally brushing against each other as they passed tools. Other times, they walked along the dry riverbeds, scouting the land, speaking sparingly, yet feeling an unspoken camaraderie. Words were not always necessary. A shared glance or a subtle gesture could communicate understanding, approval, or concern. Clara began to recognize the significance of Tayan's silence. It was not coldness, but attentiveness, a careful listening to both the land and those around him. As their routines intertwined, Tayan began to share fragments of his personal history. Around the evening fire, he recounted stories of his childhood among the tribe, of lessons learned from elders, and of the responsibilities he bore as a warrior tasked with protecting his people. He spoke of losses, of friends and family long gone, and of the weight of leadership. Clara listened with empathy, sensing the depth of his character and the burdens he carried silently. Her responses were gentle and sincere. She asked questions, not to pry, but to understand. In turn, Tayan began to observe her courage and resilience with a growing admiration. One day, as they journeyed together to check distant watering holes, Clara stumbled over a hidden rock, twisting her ankle painfully. Tayan was immediately at her side, his hand steadying her as she winced in pain. He offered a hand to help her rise, and for the first time, their eyes met in a gaze that lingered longer than necessary. In that silent moment, Clara felt a warmth bloom within her, a mixture of trust, gratitude, and something more elusive yet undeniable. Tayan, too, felt a stir of emotions he had long kept restrained. He admired her determination, her refusal to be cowed by hardship, and he began to sense that this young woman from the East had become indispensable to his daily life, and perhaps to his heart. The villagers, too, had begun to notice the subtle shift. Clara's integration into the community was evident not just in her skills, but in her demeanor. She moved with a quiet confidence, her respect for tradition evident in every gesture, her compassion clear in the way she interacted with the children and elders. Tayan, who had once observed her with cautious eyes, now occasionally walked beside her with a small nod of approval, a silent acknowledgment of her growing place within the tribe. Even the children began to tease and joke with her, their laughter filling the spaces between the desert rocks, further softening the tension that had once hung over her arrival. Their shared moments of quiet reflection also deepened their bond. Clara began to understand the subtleties of Tayan's expressions, how a slight tightening of his jaw indicated concern, how the narrowing of his eyes showed deep thought or planning. Tayan, in turn, observed Clara's resilience and empathy, recognizing the strength beneath her gentleness. They began to anticipate each other's actions, cooperating seamlessly in tasks that had once been awkward or challenging. The physical and emotional labor of frontier life became a shared language, a bridge spanning the gap between their worlds. By nightfall, Clara and Tayan often found themselves near the fire together, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Words were sparse, but the sense of connection was undeniable. Each had begun to rely on the other, not just for practical survival, but for emotional anchoring in a world that could be harsh and isolating. Clara had learned to trust Tayan's instincts, and Tayan had begun to trust her courage and judgment. In these moments, the first threads of deeper affection were woven, fragile yet persistent, a quiet promise that grew stronger with every shared task, every glance, and every act of understanding. In the harsh, unyielding desert, amidst challenges that tested body and spirit, Clara and Tayan's bond had begun to transform. It was no longer merely about respect or cooperation. It was a mutual recognition of strength, courage, and shared humanity. The foundation for love had been laid, not through grand gestures, but through daily acts of trust, empathy, and patience. As the moon rose above the jagged horizon, casting silver light across the sand, both felt, without words, that something rare and profound was beginning, a connection that could withstand the trials of the frontier, and perhaps even bridge the vast divide between their worlds. Spring was beginning to edge into the desert, softening the harsh landscape with patches of green and delicate wildflowers. The tribe's routines remained demanding, but the rhythms of daily life had grown familiar to Clara. Yet she knew that to truly belong, she would need more than skill or courage. She would need to demonstrate loyalty and commitment in a way that could not be questioned. For weeks, she had observed the tribe's rituals, learned their customs, and helped protect their land. Now, an opportunity arose that would test her resolve and prove whether she had truly become part of this community. One morning, word arrived that a nearby canyon, an important hunting and gathering site for the tribe, had been threatened by outsider settlers who sought to claim the land for themselves. The elders debated what action to take, weighing diplomacy against defense, and Tayan was chosen to lead a small group to safeguard the area. Clara knew that accompanying him would be difficult. The journey was treacherous, requiring long hours under the sun, navigating rocky terrain, and remaining vigilant for danger. But she felt an unwavering determination. This was more than a test of endurance. It was a chance to show Tayan and the tribe that her commitment went beyond words. Tayan initially resisted the idea. "It is dangerous," he said, his tone firm but calm. "You have learned much, but this is no place for hesitation." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I can endure it. I want to help, not stand aside." Tayan studied her for a long moment, and then, with a subtle nod, allowed her to join the group. The decision marked a turning point. He was placing trust in her judgment and resilience, and she would not betray it. The journey to the canyon was grueling. The sun burned high in the sky, and the desert wind whipped dust into every exposed crevice. Clara struggled at first, her muscles aching from unfamiliar exertion, but she pressed on, guided by Tayan's quiet presence and the steadying rhythm of the group. Along the way, she assisted in clearing paths, carrying supplies, and keeping an eye on the terrain for signs of danger. She quickly learned to anticipate Tayan's movements, adjusting her own steps to match his, and gradually their coordination became seamless. This partnership in action, forged through physical endurance and shared vigilance, strengthened the bond that had been building between them for months. When they reached the canyon, it became clear why Tayan's caution had been necessary. A small party of settlers had already begun marking the area for their own use. Tayan spoke softly, issuing instructions for positioning and strategy. Clara moved decisively, following his guidance while also taking initiative to secure vulnerable points. She helped calm the younger members of the tribe, ensuring they remained focused and safe. Her courage and composure in the face of potential conflict impressed not only Tayan but also the elders and other warriors. Over the next several hours, the group worked to reclaim and protect the land. Clara's familiarity with the tribe's customs became invaluable. She anticipated rituals that needed to be observed, ensured that sacred sites were respected, and helped mediate between members of the group when tensions flared. Tayan's respect for her grew with every decision she made, every thoughtful action that reinforced her loyalty and dedication. When the outsiders eventually retreated, recognizing that the tribe's resolve and organization were unyielding, Clara had proven herself not as an observer, but as an essential participant. That evening, as the group returned to the village under a sky painted with streaks of pink and gold, Taeyeon's usual reserve softened. Near the fire, he offered Clara a rare smile, a simple gesture that conveyed profound acknowledgement. "You have done well," he said quietly. "Your loyalty is evident." Clara, exhausted yet fulfilled, felt a deep sense of pride and belonging. This was not the fleeting recognition of an outsider. It was the affirmation that she had earned a place within the tribe and, more personally, in Taeyeon's regard. The village also celebrated her courage and commitment. The elders spoke words of approval, and the children, ever perceptive, treated her with renewed admiration and affection. Clara realized that the trust she had nurtured over weeks of quiet effort, patience, and respect had blossomed into acceptance. More importantly, she recognized the subtle shift in her relationship with Taeyeon. The walls that had once separated them had crumbled. The foundation of mutual respect and shared experience had strengthened into something far more intimate. That night, as the desert cooled and stars emerged in their countless brilliance, Clara and Taeyeon sat side by side near the fire. Words were few, but the silence was heavy with meaning. Taeyeon's hand brushed against hers, tentative yet deliberate, and Clara understood that her loyalty, courage, and respect had bridged the gap between them. The bond they had forged through shared trials, understanding, and commitment had now evolved into something undeniable, a deep connection that could no longer be ignored, a love built on trust and the recognition of each other's strength and heart. The desert stretched out beneath a sky painted with twilight, the horizon awash in shades of rose and gold. Clara stood at the edge of the village, watching as the last of the day's work came to a close. Children laughed as they ran between the dwellings. Elders spoke softly around fires, and the scent of evening meals mingled with the dry, fragrant air. The landscape that had once seemed so foreign now felt alive and familiar. She had endured, learned, and grown through harsh sun, grueling labor, and the quiet scrutiny of a people whose ways had initially seemed inscrutable. Yet the greatest transformation had been not in the land or the tribe, but within her own heart. Taeyeon approached from the shadow of the mesa, his steps quiet but purposeful. Clara turned to face him, her pulse quickening as she noted the subtle changes in his demeanor. The stoicism that had once marked every movement now carried a softer, warmer weight. He did not speak immediately, but the way he stopped before her, the gentle steadiness in his gaze, conveyed an understanding deeper than words. Months of shared experiences, small acts of courage, moments of care, and challenges faced together had forged a bond neither could deny. "Clara," Taeyeon began, his voice low yet steady, "you have shown strength, patience, and respect in ways I never expected. You have become part of this land, of this people, and of my life." His words, simple but profound, resonated deeply within her. Clara felt the years of fear, uncertainty, and longing give way to a quiet, unwavering certainty. She had come to the frontier as a stranger, a young woman seeking a new life, and now she stood fully present, recognized, and accepted not only by the tribe, but by the man who had seemed so distant and unyielding. They walked together toward the fire, circle where the elders and children had gathered. Taeyeon's hand brushed lightly against hers, a tentative yet deliberate touch that spoke volumes. Clara responded with a gentle squeeze, their fingers intertwining naturally as if they had always been meant to fit together. Around them, the tribe observed with quiet smiles, recognizing the culmination of months of effort, courage, and mutual understanding. Clara's acceptance by the community had been gradual, earned through consistent acts of kindness, courage, and respect. Taeyeon's acknowledgement of her place in his heart and in his life was equally hard-won, the product of shared trials and deepening connection. As the night deepened, the two of them moved to a secluded spot on a small rise overlooking the village. The stars sparkled in the vast desert sky, mirrored by the firelight below. Clara spoke softly, recounting moments of fear, discovery, and growth, and Tayan listened, responding not just with words but with presence and quiet affirmation. They shared laughter, occasional silence, and the warmth of mutual trust. In the simplicity of these shared moments, love was no longer tentative or unspoken. It had become tangible. A force as strong and enduring as the desert itself. In time, Tayan took Clara's hands fully in his, looking into her eyes with a depth that conveyed both respect and tenderness. "I did not believe it possible," he admitted, "for an outsider to understand, to endure, and to become so essential. But you have. You are part of my world, Clara, and you have my heart." Clara felt a surge of emotion, her own heart echoing the certainty of his words. She realized that love, true love, was not a matter of convenience or expectation. It was the product of understanding, patience, courage, and the willingness to meet another person fully, even when the path was difficult and uncertain. Their embrace was quiet yet profound, a merging of two worlds once divided by culture, language, and expectation. The desert around them, once harsh and indifferent, now seemed alive with affirmation, the wind, the stars, and the scent of the earth all bearing witness to their union. Clara had arrived seeking hope and perhaps security, but she found something far more enduring, a love that respected differences, honored shared experiences, and bridged divides that once seemed insurmountable. As they returned to the village hand in hand, the tribe greeted them with warmth and quiet celebration. Children ran to offer smiles and small gifts, elders nodded in approval, and even the most skeptical members recognized the strength of the bond that had formed. Clara and Tayan, once separated by fear, mistrust, and difference, now walked together as equals, partners, and companions. The frontier, with all its challenges, had not diminished them. It had forged them into a unit stronger and more resilient than either could have imagined alone. That night, beneath a sky filled with countless stars, Clara and Tayan finally allowed themselves to simply be together. Words were unnecessary. The journey, the hardships, the acts of courage, and the growing understanding had all led to this moment. Love had bridged the divide between East and West, between outsider and warrior, between two hearts that had learned to trust, to respect, and ultimately to belong to one another. The desert, eternal and vast, bore witness to a love that would endure, resilient as the land itself, unyielding in its quiet, profound strength.